We could spend an entire episode just discussing the amazing biography of our guest today. She is one of the most distinguished novelists, and we are incredibly grateful to be in conversation today with the incomparable Alice Hoffman.
Alice Hoffman has published over 30 novels, 3 books of short fiction, and 8 books for children and young adults. Her work has been published in more than 20 translations and more than 100 foreign editions. Her novels have received mention as notable books of the year by the New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, the Los Angeles Times, Library Journal, and People magazine. Her novels include the Oprah's Book Club selection Here on Earth, the cult classic Practical Magic, The Dove Keepers, which is a critically acclaimed book that Toni Morrison called a major contribution to 21st century literature, and the award-winning and recent New York Times bestsellers, The Museum of Extraordinary Things, The Marriage of Opposites, and Faithful.
In 2017, Alice released The Rules of Magic, a prequel to Practical Magic. The Rules of Magic was selected as a Library Reads, Indie Next List, and Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick. And I have to say, it is one of my favorite books. In 2020, the third book in the Practical Magic series, Magic Lessons, was published and received praise from the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, the Boston Globe, and lots of our library patrons. The fourth and final book in the Practical Magic series, The Book of Magic, came out last month, and I am currently trying to devour and savor this book simultaneously.
You seem like you're really trying to pace yourself. I want to continue it, but I also don't want it to be over.
It's the struggle when you have a great book.
So welcome to the first 50 pages, Alice.
Thank you so much for having me here.
It does seem quite magical to have you as our guest today, and we can't wait to talk about your latest book, The Book of Magic. For listeners who may not be familiar with the Practical Magic series, could you tell us a little bit about the Owens family and their curse?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I wrote a book, I think it was 25 years ago, I'm not sure. It might have been a little bit longer, about 2 sisters named Sally and Jillian, who came from a family in which magic was inherited, and which was also, there was also a curse involved in this family. And the curse was whoever was to fall in love with them would meet with an untimely death. And so as I've written more about the family, especially in Magic Lessons, which is kind of the origin story about Maria Owens, who's the original ancestor, I explain why that curse came to be. And it came to be because Maria fell in love with the wrong man, as many people do. And this wrong man happened to be during the Salem witch trials, and he was one of the judges, John Hawthorne, who was a relative of Nathaniel Hawthorne's. And so she put on this kind of protective curse on all the generations to follow to protect them from love. But of course, doing that became a curse, because if you're protected from love, you're missing out on a huge part of being human. So that's really what the books are about, is, about the curse and about the breaking of the curse and about breaking family trauma and tragedies and patterns and kind of starting anew.
So when you started out writing Practical Magic, did you envision this becoming a series of books? Was that always in the back of your mind?
No, never. And if I had been smart enough to have thought of that, I would have had an outline and I would have planned out the books, but I never thought I would go back to it. And the only reason I did was because I had readers contacting me saying, I think there's more to the story. I think you should write a sequel. And as I started to think about it, I thought they're right. This is what I should do. But I decided to first write a prequel, which is The Rules of Magic, which takes place in the 60s in New York City in Greenwich Village, which is my favorite place, my favorite time, and the time I grew up there. So I just felt like, and when I was done with that, I felt, well, I really want to go back further in time in Magic Lessons to see how this whole thing started. And then with the Book of Magic, my newest book, it's kind of closure for me, but also for the characters. And also, I think, for many of the readers who've been so incredibly dedicated and terrific about the books.
And I know we as fans definitely appreciate that too. We always like to be able to know more about those characters we come to know and love and kind of what happens to them and, you know, all of that. So while you were writing, you know, we've talked about, you know, the Practical Magic series. Was there a character or a part of the story that surprised you and kind of came to life differently than you had planned?
You know, it's funny that you would ask that because that happens to me all the time. You know, I make an outline and I have poster boards with post-it notes, and then something will happen and everything changes. And one of the things that happened was in Rules of Magic, I was writing about Franny and Jet. They are in Practical Magic the elderly aunts or aunts, and then in Rules of Magic they're young girls and women. And I didn't know they had a brother, Vincent. He just like walked in and took over. I fell in love with him, and you know, he became such an important part of the family and the plot. And you know, I never expected that to happen. That was a complete surprise to me.
I really love that you went back to them younger, because in Practical Magic, we see them as older and a bit eccentric, but then you take us back to when they were young, and you know, just it gives you such an appreciation for the character development and the story arc. It's just, I love that.
Thank you. Well, you know what I was thinking? I was thinking about how we could never really know our older relatives,
Yes.
and you know, because we didn't know them when they were young, and our younger relatives can't know us because they see us as who we are now. They have no idea the trouble we got into and the things that happened to us. And you know, if only they could time travel and be there with us in Greenwich Village, they would understand us. And it was coming from that place of, you know, how do you get to know the people in your family?
And I know that other readers have told you this too, that in the Rules of Magic, you know, there's some tears shed if you're invested in that story. It is a beautiful story, and there is, you know, so many, you know, hope and wonderful things that happen in the story. But yeah, and I have to say, for me too, that was the first book that I cried reading in a long time. I was really invested in those characters.
You know, I hate to say this, but I'm so glad to hear that.
No. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I didn't see it coming. That was the other thing. Like sometimes you're reading a book and you know there's sad things. And you kind of know, you know, because of the curse that something might happen. But I was so invested in your characters that, yeah, there were definitely tears.
Thank you. Well, you know, I have to say that when I was writing the Book of Magic, I cried the whole time I was writing it. I mean, I still read it and I still cry because just what you were saying, you know, life is love, but it's also loss. And, you know, as these characters get older, things happen, there's loss involved. And that was hard for me as a writer. So, you know, I want you to cry because I feel that then you're feeling what I'm feeling. You're feeling the characters.
Yeah, I definitely think it helps us make that, you know, connection to the books. So like in this series, you know, it seems like it's such a wonderful balance of, you know, research, but also storytelling. Is the magic in your books based on your research, or is it like totally, you know, invented?
It's completely based on research, and you know, anything to do with herbs or any spells, it's all research because I don't think I want to take it upon myself to invent that.
Fair.
But I also kind of try to make certain that nothing dangerous is in there, so that nobody, you know, no 12-year-old reader is going to, you know, do something to your dog. Or, you know, when the movie came out, they did hire an alleged witch, and they put some spells in there that people actually tried to complete. And one of them, they broke into, I think it was Brad Pitt's house and tried to complete a love spell, which she was promptly arrested. It didn't work out for her, but yeah, so I'm pretty careful about it. And I want to be as true to herbal and spiritual and everything to do with witchery as I can possibly be.
So I have always been drawn to stories about witches. And I grew up on a steady diet of fairy tales. And I remember one of the first books that consumed my imagination that I can read on my own was Roald Dahl's The Witches. I was both terrified and fascinated by this book. But something really clicked into place for me when I heard you talking in another interview about why little girls, especially, are interested in witches. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I felt the same way. Well, when I was growing up, let's say at Halloween, you had two choices. You could be a princess or a witch. I always chose the witch. And I think most little girls are still choosing the witch, even though they have like more options than I did. And I think, it's the one female mythic figure with power. And, when you read about witches and fairy tales, they're scary because they have power, but they're not necessarily scary to us, to females. So I think it's very natural for girls to still be drawn to witches. And, when I was doing my research, I can't remember the exact percentage, but something like 80% of the heroes in fairy tales are female. So it's girls saving themselves, girls saving their brothers who are climbing into the oven, girls, finding their path through the woods. And I think that, I was a fairy tale fanatic also. I think that's part of it, is that we could see ourselves in a different way, in an active way, in reading fairy tales. Not everybody was Sleeping Beauty. Some people were finding their way through the woods.
And, I was thinking about this a little more, like, what is the fairy tale I went back to, over and over and over again? And I think for me, it was Cinderella, but not because of Prince Charming. I was more consumed with the relationship of the sisters towards her and like that's what consumed me, how the women in the story treated each other. And I don't think I could really identify that until thinking about it a little more through some of these things.
That makes perfect sense, because I think that fairy tales are the most psychologically astute tales for children. And I think that when children read them, they get that. They get that they're being told the truth about very deep emotional issues. Like you just said, the stepsisters. There's also the fairy godmother in there, so like it's kind of the whole range of, kind of female relationships, and it's not sugar coated, it's very, it can be brutal out there.
Yeah. And you have a section on your website too, where you have fairy tales that you have written. And I think it's just such a fun thing to visit.
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
and it's fun to write also.
Yeah, just such a fun thing because you change them out pretty regularly.
Yeah.
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 So
true.
Yeah. So I definitely recommend go read the fairy tales on Alice Hoffman's website. One of the themes that runs throughout the Practical Magic series is the relationships, and often very complicated relationships, that women have with each other, especially in families. And I think I mentioned, I love the generational aspects of the story of the series, this collective wisdom and pain that is passed from one generation to the next, and the lengths we go to protect the ones we love. And there are so many moments in the book series. And I want to tell you about one of my favorite. just because I have to.
We got to have a fangirl moment.
It's not just me, because I have a friend and colleague who had posted on social media about this too. So there's a scene in Magic Lessons, so the third book in the series, that takes us back to where the curse on the Owens bloodline is born. And the scene is so powerful. So Maria had just experienced an incredible trauma, and yet she continues with hope and determination. And it's in that moment on this page 34 that we know she is a survivor. You write, she already knew that the past was over and done. She would never again watch another woman burn. And when I read that, I had to shut the book and take a break, because it was such a powerful statement in just those two lines. And
Thank you for
it's
saying that. I have to say, I feel like crying just hearing that because I feel like that's what the books are about.
yeah, it just I was like, wow. Um, yeah, it was, and it stays with me now.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, part of the reason the books are so popular is because it's about sisterhood and about support women supporting other women. And the relationships are complicated and they get messed up and people can betray each other. But basically at the heart of it, the core of it is really about sisterhood and that idea of Maria being a survivor, which is really important to me. I'm a breast cancer survivor, but I am interested in survivorship, at every level. And the fact that she's a survivor and the fact that she would never watch a woman burn and that she would never betray anyone and that she was going to do her best to have a life despite the fact that all the odds are against her, is really what the stories are about.
And this is the 1600s, right? When this story is taking place, but there's so many parallels to our current times in a lot of ways. And yeah,
Yeah,
so good.
I think that's true. Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I mean, I didn't even realize this when I was writing it was, it takes place around the time of the plague. And so there were so many similarities writing it to what was happening to us with COVID and, kind of blaming the other and outcasts and refugees and all of that, that kind of feeling of medicine that is really works and yet is thought to be, kind of witchcraft, just the fact that, in the 17th century, that women who were healers had more success in saving their patients than the men who were physicians was because they washed their hands. And so throughout the series, there's this black soap that the Owens women make. And then I thought, oh, of course, that's when it started. It was, antibacterial soap that they used in the 17th century.
So I'll admit, the Book of Magic had me from the dedication page in the very first line of the book, for obvious reasons. You make reference to many books throughout the story. Are these books that have influenced you in your life? Is there a book or an author in particular that holds a special place in your heart?
Well, the Book of Magic kind of is an homage for me to librarians and libraries because I feel that librarians saved my life, starting with my school librarian, Mrs. Ainken. Um, so it's kind of, the whole book is about books and about libraries. And I do have a list in the book of books that were really special to me at different, times in my life, books that I felt like saved my life, showed me a path. And it's a very eclectic mix of books, but, I just kind of wanted to give them a shout out. And, I felt like this was my opportunity to do that.
As librarians, one of our very favorite things to discuss is the magic of books. We truly believe that words have power and books are life-changing. And one of your most famous quotes, especially in library circles, is, "Books may well be the only true magic." So I have to ask, what magical thing happens for you when you read a book?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that because for me, the most magical thing was the first time of walking into a library because I feel like, and this is why I am a fanatic about libraries and librarians. I feel like for me and for so many other children, it was the first time I really had the opportunity to make my own choices and the whole world opened to me. I personally feel that my life would have been completely different if I wasn't a reader and if I didn't go to libraries. I grew up in kind of a bad neighborhood. I didn't see many options until I became a reader. And I think that's so true for kids today. So, for me, writing about books and writing about libraries just comes naturally. But for me, books were the magic in my life. They still are. And, it was my way to see what other worlds were like, but also my way of escaping my life. It was kind of my therapy. And, it was really my everything. It was my magic. And I still feel that way today, that for me, writing has become that for me too, that's the magic in my life.
So you also have written, several books for young readers, which we haven't really touched on. What
Yeah.
made you decide to write for a younger audience?
I think I wanted to do it because I feel that what you read when you're about 12 or 13 affects you more than anything else and stays with you in such a deep way. I mean, for me, there are many, many books, but the one author that really stood out for me at that time in my life was Ray Bradbury, who I still adore, and I feel like every 12 and 13-year-old kid should be reading Ray Bradbury because he presents such a moral world of good and evil. He's kind of like this father figure in some ways, and yet the books are filled with magic. And of course he has the classic book of Fahrenheit 451, which is all about the importance of books, and so that they're so important and so dangerous that
Yes.
the government wants to burn them all, and that there are people who are willing to become a book, to memorize a book so that the books aren't lost. To me, that book just kind of changed my life. And even years later, when I had writer's block for the first time after 9/11, I couldn't write at all. And I was lucky enough or smart enough to know to go to Ray Bradbury and reread Fahrenheit 451 so I would remember how important books are.
Yeah. And I think, books have the power to change people, to change us. And that makes them a target,
It makes them a target. I mean, why else would there be banned books?
Yeah.
They're dangerous. They may give people ideas.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's always so interesting to me that you know, if a child reads, then they form their own opinions,
Yeah.
and and then the library becomes the world.
Yeah. You have a really great newsletter that you send out monthly, and the last few months have been dedicated to the Practical Magic series. And there's really great discussion questions for the books. One of my favorite questions is, in a family where love is destined to bring loss, so we're talking about the curse, the Owen's curse, how do the characters continue to find the courage to love more and not less? So
Yeah,
that,
it's true. It's true for them.
that I was like, oh, I gotta think about that one for a while, and think about, that's a challenge in my own life, right? How do we continue to find the courage to love more and not less?
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge for me too. I think it is for most people. You get hurt, you get betrayed. The world is difficult. You have terrible loss. How do you continue to be a person who's able to love? It's a constant challenge. And it's something that I don't really know the answer to, which is, I think, why I keep writing about it. Because I think very often, and for me, at any rate, I think I'm much smarter as an author than I am as a person. So I'm kind of looking for the answers to questions just like that. How do you love more, not less?
Yeah.
And now we're going to try to get you to spill the beans a little bit with our last question. So we've heard that the Practical Magic series could be coming to television as a long-form series. Is this something that's still in the works? Or, would you mind sharing any details about what you might be working on now?
Yeah, well, it definitely is in the works. The producer of Practical Magic also bought the Rules of Magic and Magic Lessons. And so it would be a series that dealt with all the different time periods and all the different members of the family, which I think would be really exciting.
Yes, we're kind of cheering over here silently.
Yes, I know. I want it to be too. So, I'm hoping that it happens. And also another book of mine called The World That We Knew, which takes place during the Holocaust, was also bought. We'll see if it becomes a series or not. You just never know.
That was a great book. I could see that being such a great series too. Yeah.
Thank you. I think so too. So, I'm excited about that. And I'm working on a book right now that's completely different, even though I have to say I really want to go back to magic. It's hard for me not to. And I have an idea that's somewhat related, but we'll see what happens. But right now I'm working on a book that's biblical, and it's been a huge amount of research, and I'm just about done. And I think it'll be out next year. So I don't want to talk about it too much till it's like completely, but it's really about women's relationships with each other. And sometimes you don't realize what a book is about until you're through with it or until you're writing it. It's really about kind of the other mothers that we find in our lives, which has certainly happened to me, whether it's a mentor or a librarian or a teacher or a neighbor, that sometimes, when we need to, we find other women in our lives who can teach us what we need to know at that particular time in our life.
Well, that is a great tease for that.
Yeah, I was now we're treated like counting down the days. So
we will definitely keep our eyes out for that. Well, Alice, it has been a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you so much for the conversation, for the wisdom, for the joy, for your books. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I've loved talking to you, and thank you so much for all you do for books. I really appreciate that. Take care.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you, Alice.
Bye-bye.